Okay, think about this for a second. You're trying to focus, right? Find some quiet inside your head in, well, let's face it, a pretty distracting world. It can feel almost impossible sometimes. But what if there was, like, a detailed guide, a map for training your mind to find real stillness, real focus? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're exploring the Buddhist concept of samadhi. Now, it often gets translated simply as concentration, but the term really points to something deeper, a state of meditative absorption. And we're using a specific teaching as our guide today, one that really unpacks samadhi at different levels, drawing from, ancient Buddhist scriptures. So our mission here is to unpack this teaching, get a handle on its core ideas, pull out the key insights, and really see what it tells us about focusing the mind. We'll stick close to the text we have, trying to make it clear for everyone listening.
Yeah, and it's quite a specific source we're looking at. It's a discourse, a teaching that actually starts by quoting verses directly from the Pali Canon, really old scriptures. And then this teaching goes on to explain those verses. It gives you both the theory, sometimes called pariyatti, and crucially, it emphasizes the practical side, the actual experience. That's the Payapati.
Theory and practice over there.
Exactly. And the core question these Pali verses tackle is essentially, how did the Buddha, or the Blessed One, Bhagavata, teach samadhi well?
Mm.
And the answer in this teaching comes in two main flavors, you could say. There's the lower way, hihimen pariyana, and the higher way, uparima pariyana.
Lower and higher ways.
Right. And the discourse spends a good amount of time explaining these, especially focusing on how you actually experience these stages of concentration.
All right, let's start there then, this lower way. Sounds foundational. What does the source actually say about samadhi at this initial level?
Well, the teaching says that through this lower way, a practitioner described as a noble disciple, Arya Savaka, they achieve samadhi and this thing called one-pointedness of mind, sitasikakitat. And the key phrase for how this happens is making the mind free from objects. Vozagramake-kattva.
Making the mind free from objects. Huh. That sounds, well, it sounds almost opposite to how my mind usually works. It's always grabbing onto something. So what does that phrase, free from objects, actually mean in practice, according to this teaching?
Right. It's a bit counterintuitive at first glance, but it means the mind learns to detach from the six kinds of, well, objects or automania that it normally engages with. These are the familiar ones. Things we see, forms, things we hear, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations.
Okay, the five senses.
Exactly. And the sixth one, which is super important for meditation, is mind objects. So thoughts, ideas, memories, emotions, mental pictures, basically everything happening internally.
Ah, so it's detachment from all of that, sensory stuff and mental stuff.
That's the goal in this lower samadhi, yeah, letting go of all of it. The source actually uses some really nice analogies to paint a picture. Think of like an egg yolk separating cleanly from the white. It comes distinct, pure.
Mm-hmm.
Or imagine water in a glass, totally still, no breeze, no ripples. Perfectly calm, perfectly clear, right down to the center. That's the kind of stillness and purity it's talking about.
Wow, okay, so it's a really profound stillness then. The mind just settles down, unbothered by senses or thoughts. Does the source say more about, what that feels like? Or where it's experienced? Is it just in your head?
Yes, and this is where that practical side, the Pativedha, really comes through strongly in this teaching. It's not just an abstract idea, this pure, detached, still state of mind.
Right.
It's described as being perceived internally. Specifically, the source says it's seen clearly by something it calls the subtle human body.
The subtle human body, kastranot laj.lu.
That's the term used, yes. And within this teaching's framework, this subtle body is located right at the very center of this luminous sphere. The source calls it the Dhammakaya sphere,
A sphere inside.
yeah, located within the practitioner. And when the mind gets into that really still, detached state, it's described as being one ekagata, completely steady,
Yeah.
right there at the center of this sphere. And it's the subtle body that perceives this.
Okay, that's a very specific internal landscape being described. A sphere, a subtle body, seeing the stillness at the center.
It is. And the teaching even makes a point of contrasting this inner focus, this detachment at the center, with lots of other meditation techniques that use external objects. It acknowledges those exist, but emphasizes that for the path described here, this internal experience seen by the subtle body is the key approach for this lower level of samadhi.
Right, so it's not just calm down, it's find this specific internal center and see the stillness there with the subtle body. That paints a much clearer picture. Okay, so if that's the foundational lower way, where does the higher way take us? How does it build on that stillness?
Good question. The source explains that once you've established that really stable, centered state from the lower way, you can then progress. You can go deeper. And that's what the teaching calls the higher Samadhi. And this is where we get into the states known as the Jhanas.
Oh, the Jhanas, meditative absorptions, right.
Exactly. The higher way basically maps out the progression through 4 increasingly refined jhana states. And the practical instruction for getting there starts with the mind staying naturally still. The teaching uses a specific Thai phrase, Utnich, meaning like snout and still. But crucially, it emphasizes stopping at the center of the center, Gleichen, right within that pure mind sphere you reached earlier.
Center of the center. Wow, that implies even more precision.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the teaching says when this stopping, this stillness at the very center is just right, it uses the phrase ki tu suan ko, like when the fit or measure is correct. Then something happens. A jhana sphere emerges right from the center of that mind sphere.
Whoa, a jhana sphere just emerges. That's a really vivid image. What does the source say it looks like?
It's described in, well, remarkable detail. The first one, the sphere for the first jhana, is apparently quite large. The text specifies 8 cubits across, 1 cubit thick.
That is specific.
Yeah. And it's described as perfectly round, bright, shining like a really clean mirror. And according to this teaching, when the practitioner enters that first jhana, their subtle human body, the same one we talked about before, is seen sitting right inside this big, bright sphere.
Okay, so the subtle body is now inside this jhana sphere. Fascinating.
And then the discourse goes on to lay out the characteristics of the 4 jhanas. It draws on the Pali scriptures, but adds this practical experiential commentary. Each jhana is defined by certain mental factors, all jhana being present or absent.
Right, let's walk through them. The first jhana.
Okay, the first jhana. You get there by withdrawing the mind from sense desires and unwholesome thoughts or states. The experience itself is marked by what's called vitakka and vikara, often translated as initial and sustained thought or application. The teaching here explains them more like mulling over the jhana vitakka and pondering the jhana vikara. So there's still some mental activity directed at the state itself.
Okay, an active focus.
Right. And alongside that, there's intense rapture piti and a deep pleasure, sukha. Really positive feelings. And these arise directly from that seclusion, from that concentration.
So a very joyful, absorbed state, but still with that mental mulling and pondering. Got it. What about the second jhana? How does it deepen?
In the second jhana, that active thinking, the vitakka and vikara, they cease completely. They're let go of. So the mind becomes even more settled internally. Really unified, just one-pointed. The rapture, piti, and the pleasure, sukha, are still there, but now they're said to be born purely from the concentration itself, not from the initial mulling.
Ah, so the joy comes directly from the stillness now.
Exactly. And interestingly, the source notes that at this stage, it's a different subtle body seen entering the jhana sphere, what it calls a subtle celestial body, kasis tipup lajluat.
A celestial body. Okay. Moving on up then. What's the third jhana like?
Progressing further into the third jhana, that really intense feeling of rapture, the piti, actually fades away. What remains is equanimity, upaka, and mindfulness, satipusi. But there's still a strong sense of pleasure, sukha, which is experienced by the subtle body.
So the intense excitement drops, but a calmer pleasure remains, with mindfulness and balance.
Precisely. And the teaching identifies yet another subtle body entering the sphere here, the subtle form realm body, kishvrusuprom lajdaluat. This body is said to remain focused on that refined pleasure within the state of equanimity.
Okay, subtle form realm body. And the fourth jhana. What's left then?
The fourth jhana is reached by letting go of even that pleasure and any lingering subtle displeasure or pain. It transcends both. It's described as a state of pure equanimity and purified mindfulness. The Pali term is upekasati parisuddhya. It's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just this profound balance and clarity.
Wow, pure balance.
And following the pattern, the source indicates another subtle body enters this state, the subtle formless realm body, Kashuprofarcham. This is the most refined state within these 4 form jhanas.
Formless realm body in the fourth jhana. That's quite a progression.
It is. And the really crucial practical point, the Pativedha or realization that this teaching highlights again and again, is that this whole journey, seeing the mind still, seeing the spheres emerge, seeing these different subtle bodies enter the jhanas, this isn't just, a theory or a metaphor. It's presented as something the practitioner directly sees, perceives, and knows for themselves. Through the internal awareness, the I, if you will, of the subtle body itself, it's described as a verifiable, internal reality within this specific meditative tradition.
That makes it sound less like just concepts and more like experiential landmarks on an inner journey. Very specific ones, based on this teaching. Now, you mentioned the four-form jhanas. Does the source hint at what lies beyond those?
It does, briefly. It mentions that the path continues from there into what are called the formless jhanas, and ultimately the goal is nibbana, liberation. It doesn't go into huge detail on these higher stages in this particular section, but it does note that reaching nibbana is, quote, not easy.
Understandable.
And it connects these deeper stages to moving beyond the fundamental defilements, things like greed, raga, aversion, dosa, and delusion, moha. It talks about this progression as shifting away from conditioned states, sakata, things dependent on causes, towards the unconditioned, athokrata, towards elements, the two that are uncontaminated, viraga, free from those defilements. It's pointing towards ultimate freedom.
Okay. So just to recap where we've journeyed based on this teaching, we started with this idea of a foundational stillness, a mind detached from all the usual objects, sensory and mental, a stillness perceived internally at the center by a subtle human body within a sphere.
The lower way.
Right. And from that base, the higher way unfolds through these four jhanas, these increasingly refined states of deep absorption, each with its own distinct characteristics, changing mental factors like focus, rapture, pleasure, equanimity.
Yeah, and each associated in this teaching with the emergence of a specific jhana sphere and the entry of a progressively more subtle body into that sphere.
It's quite a detailed internal map.
It really is. This source gives a very particular framework, both theoretical and practical, for understanding the depth and the stages of samadhi as seen in this tradition. It shows it's not just about, feeling a bit calmer. It's presented as a systematic training, a process of refining consciousness through very distinct internal states.
And why should you, listening, care about this specific map?
Well, I think understanding these levels, even just conceptually, can provide a kind of roadmap, whether you're seriously into meditation or maybe just curious about gaining more focus in your life. This teaching lays out the potential. It shows these incredibly deep states of peace, stability, and refined awareness are, according to this path, achievable.
It outlines a structured process, yeah, with identifiable landmarks, even if perceiving them requires dedicated practice according to their method. It maps a path from basic mental stilling all the way to profound absorption and points beyond.
So we've seen how this teaching charts the territory of samadhi, from quieting the noise to these deep absorptions.
A path from stillness to spheres, subtle bodies, and the potential for liberation. And here's maybe the really fascinating question this leaves us with. If the mind can be trained, as this teaching describes, to detach so completely from the outside world, from its own usual chatter, and if it can enter these states described with such, frankly, extraordinary internal phenomena, subtle bodies, spheres emerging from centers, what does that ultimately suggest about the true nature, the potential of consciousness itself? Is it something far vaster, far more capable than our everyday busy experience usually lets us see?
That's perhaps the biggest invitation the teaching offers, to explore that potential for yourself.